Hi, my name is Taylor Kiefer, and this is my Geography of Europe mapping project. The two topics I looked at were the gender pay gap in Europe versus maternity leave. So, as an introduction, I am trying to answer the question, is there a correlation between how much maternity leave a country offers and the gap in pay between men and women? I had some factors to consider when it came to maternity leave. For example, certain amounts of leave are offered full pay, some are partial, and some are none. So, usually, with a lot of countries, for the first 14, 16 weeks, you'll get full pay. After that, we'll go down to partial pay, 80% of salary, and then some of it can just be taken but with no pay towards the end. Another factor to consider is that more women than men work part-time, even though there are full-time and salaried, of course, still. But it depends on if those part-time leaves will offer the same amount of pay and the same amount of weeks as a full-time or salaried position. And then many countries offer parental leave. So that includes paternity leave, which usually more is offered to the women, but some you can just split up amongst both parents. And this would work in the case of same-sex couples. So my study just looked at longest length of maternity leave offered regardless of any other factors. So even unpaid leave. Just what is offered so you can come back to the job. So some of the sources and methods I looked at were to look at news and scholarly articles. So I looked about 6 probably of those. I came up with my hypothesis from class readings, including Stephen Hill's books. I found statistics for both of my topics on Eurostat. And the location quotient was used in order to compare stats of the different countries. So I took basically the average of the weeks and percentages and came up with my location quotient. So the formula is listed here, but mine might have worked a little differently in this case. So my prediction was that countries with more maternity leave will have a smaller wage gap between genders. The reason I came up with this was because Stephen Hill discusses sort of the myth of the overtaxed American, which he negates, but it does have an origin somewhere. And a lot of this is because Europe has more liberal policies. So, for example, the way that money is used with those taxes aids more in family life. So the pay gap should be smaller because of more liberal values, more independent women, less marriage dependent, more marriage is sort of on the decline there, but people are still having families. And then, of course, their idea is that happier home life will result in happier workers. So therefore, more maternity leave, smaller pay wage gap just seems to make sense with their philosophies. So on to the maps. So let's see, this is my weeks of maternity leave in Europe. So darkest color is purple, and that would be the longest amount of leave offered. So those countries include Norway with 45 weeks and the UK with a staggering 52 weeks, although a lot of that is unpaid. And then the light blue color are the shortest maternity leaves, which are Sweden with 14 weeks, Belgium with 15, and Germany with 14. And then the EU average is 21.48 weeks, and Italy sort of hits that right in the middle. This is my gender pay gap map. So here we did the smallest gaps in the light blue. So that would be Poland with 6.4 and Italy with 7.3. And then the dark purple were the biggest gaps. So that'd be Czech Republic 22.1, Austria 23, and Estonia 29.9, which was the biggest one. And then that EU average was 15.8%. With France and Sweden being in that sort of average. So this is my side-by-side comparison of the maps. Um, my hypothesis sort of held true here in Poland and Portugal, which had above average maternity leave and a smaller pay gap. And then Austria and Switzerland, although Switzerland is not in the EU, I still found data for them, so I included them in here. They both had below average maternity leave with that larger pay gap. So they sort of went against that liberal sense of policies that I thought Europe had. And as you can see, there's really no trend regionally. It just is come from country to country. An outlier amongst a few others, though, was the UK, which had the most generous maternity leave offered, although unpaid for a lot of it. And they also had a larger pay gap. Not super bad over the average, but still over. So this is a bar graph of the data that I made here. We're looking at the percentage for pay gap. So for example, Austria has that 23-ish% gap in pay. And then number of weeks for maternity leave. So we see, I think, Ireland with that like 42-ish. There's not really a trend again that you can see here, but it's a good visual of the differences in the countries. The graph that I made did 15 of the countries out of the 30 I surveyed. So what ended up happening is I found this quote from this article in Forbes. We would assume that longer maternity leave is going to increase the pay gap. So this was sort of against my original prediction, but when we allot women more time off, with sometimes partial to no pay, we have to account for absence, and subsequently men will end up getting paid more. So, all of which is why it seems so strange to me that people really do campaign as part of the effort to reduce the gap for an increase in leave. The actual effect works entirely the other way around. So this article sort of made me realize that my hypothesis, based on what I had read, didn't really pan out, because when you reduce the gap and there's an increase in leave, there needs to be an account for who is paying these women while they're on leave. Or men, I suppose, in the case of paternity leave. But we see, or I have this quote too from the Pew Research Center, that some countries that offer more liberal parental leave policies have a higher pay gap among men and women 30 to 34 years, which sort of fits with that last quote. So as you can see, these are some of the countries with a high maternity leave and a large pay gap. So I just kind of looked at anything that went over 20% in 20 weeks, roughly, just to get an idea, because there wasn't really a general trend, but these are some of the countries that had those characteristics. So we have Estonia, Ireland, you see a lot of maternity leave offered, and not a super high gender pay gap, but compared to maternity leave. And then we have Slovakia, United Kingdom. So on this final quote, it sort of offers a solution to this issue. The gender pay gap, widely discussed in Germany, has been calculated at 27% in 2006. Further analysis, however, revealed that the difference between the hourly wage of female and male employees decreases to 6% when circumstances such as economic sector and occupation, job tenure, skills level, working time, and parental leave are factored in. So we're taking in all those factors to consider that I said at the beginning as far as why there is that gap. An investment in childcare facilities would reduce the pay gap by enabling women to return to work and to work full-time. So this comes to the conclusion that in order to close the pay gap, parental leave cannot rely on maternity leave alone. It must be equal between both parents. And especially in the case of same-sex couples having families as well, there needs to be an account for that in that time when you adopt a child or have a child in another way. There still needs to be an equal amount of time offered. And then if we're splitting up leave responsibilities, so let's say a woman gets a certain amount of time off and then can go back to work, and then the father can take over, or vice versa, depending on how much recovery time a woman needs. That should alleviate some of the stress on the pay gap as far as making up for women in the workplace that are taking that long in maternity leave. So that is my presentation. Thanks very much for listening, and I hope you liked it.